Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the our monthly webinar organised by the Australian Research Institute for Environmental Law. And today we have a very special presentation on soils governance, and we have 4 excellent speakers and presentations. So I will move quickly into some housekeeping matters before I introduce our chair for the session. My name is Matthew Baird. I'm the director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. And every month we've been developing a series of webinars on particular environmental law topics. So welcome to this first in a series of webinars and events focusing on soils governance in Southeast Asia and Asia. So can I first ask, if you have a question and and answer, and I'm sure there'll be a number of questions coming from a number of people, please use the Q&A box. And if you click on that, it's at the bottom bar next to the raise hand. You can type in your question for the speakers, and they can answer that during the presentation or at the conclusion in the moderated discussions. And also at the end, when we call for questions, if you also want to raise your hand, there will be a time for questions and answer at the end. Also, this is our first webinar that we are live streaming on our YouTube channel. So thank you all, the technical people who made that possible. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the chair, very distinguished, and it's a great honour to have Dr. Irina Heuser to be the chair for the session and to introduce our speakers. Dr. Heuser is the chair of the Specialist Group on Soil Desertification and Sustainable Agriculture of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and has held this honorary position since 2018. She works in her normal life as head of a unit dealing with EU policy, EU law and development policy in a ministry in Potsdam, Germany, and in her free time, she is active in the field of environmental policy and law, and especially in soil protection law for more than 30 years. So Dr. Heuser has written several articles on soil, agricultural and sustainability law in the context of national, EU and international law, and is the co-editor of the International Yearbook on Soil Law and Policy. And it's a great pleasure that I offer you the chair for this session on soils governance in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much, Dr. Heuser.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and also a heartfelt welcome from my side. And I'm very grateful to Ariel for organizing and holding this webinar. And I'm also thankful for the support in this webinar of UBA, the German Environment Agency, the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, and my own organization, IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, which has been dealing with the topic of soil protection law and sustainable use of soils. The term soil governance is quite relatively new. For many years, there was a first resolution at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Amman in 2000, which has put the global focus on a legal instrument for soil protection, because there is no Rio or other convention that specifically addresses soil protection. My dear WSL colleagues, Professor Ian Hannon and Professor Ben Bohr, investigated and presented various possibilities of legal instruments for soil on all levels, the national, the regional, the international level. But only after the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its SDGs, especially SDG 15, on life on land, and the target of LDN, land degradation neutrality, in 2012, the connections between climate change, biodiversity loss, food security, preventing soil and land degradation received the necessary attention. Rather, we try to shed more light on the connections between these topics and organize webinars like this one today. In the course of today's discussion, we will certainly also talk about other regional models later on. Today, we would like to introduce you to soil governance in Southeast Asia. And I can't think of a better speaker for this subject than Professor Ian Hannan, the former chair of our specialist group for soil desertification and sustainable agriculture of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law for 15 years. Dr. Ian Hannan is an adjunct associate professor at the Australian Centre for Agriculture and Law at the University of New England and holds a bachelor's degrees in agricultural science and ecology, a master's degree in science and environmental law, and a doctorate in environmental law. And Professor Hannan has consulted to governance and environmental institutions on law and policy of sustainable land management, specializing in land degradation and dryland agriculture. And he has assisted many countries in drafting soil legislation over many, many years. He has numerous book and journal publications on national and international environmental law and policy on land degradation and sustainable use of soil. Professor Dr. Ian Hannan will give us an overview of the issues of soil and soil conservation in Southeast Asia. And I'm so much looking forward to your presentation, Ian. You have the floor for the next 20 minutes.
Hello, Ian.
Hello, Ian, can you hear us?
You may be on mute. I think you're still on mute.
Hello.
Thank you. Good now.
Okay. Okay, for the next 20 minutes or so, I just want to give a brief overview of some aspects of the environmental law and in relation to soils in the ASEAN region. And I'll do this by making a few introductory points, then talk a little bit about some of the national instruments in existence and soil, and a few remarks about some of the regional instruments in relationship to soils, and then a few concluding points. Well, the first point to consider is that the Southeast Asian region consists of two geographic aspects: the mainland component, which comprises the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Singapore, and then what's referred to as the insular component, which includes the areas of countries of Indonesia, the Philippines, Brunei, and Timor-Leste. But in total, this area we're considering today occupies around 3% of the total world land area. So it's quite a significant in that regard. It's within the tropical and subtropical climatic zones and characterized by a high annual precipitation from the monsoon weather system. It's also characterized by three intermingled physical elements: mountain ranges, plains and plateaus, and some very extensive drainage systems, including the Mekong and the Irrawaddy basins. So in reference to this map here, for the people not familiar with this region, it's this circular zone in the center of this map here that we're concerned with today, the 11 countries of the Southeast Asian region. Firstly, we need to just have a quick look at what the term soil governance means or comprises. And under the UN FAO definition, it concerns policies and strategies and the processes of decision-making by nation states and local governments and how the soil is utilised. And to do this effectively, worldwide, it requires international and national collaboration between governments, local authorities, citizen groups to ensure that legislation, policies and practices and methodologies to govern the use of soil are properly constructed and implemented. In relation to the situation with what we refer to as national instruments related to soil in Southeast Asia, the first point to be familiar with is that the land characteristics, the climate characteristics, and land use have very much influenced the type of environmental instruments introduced in this region since the early 1950s. But more recently, 14 soil parameters have been used to identify what we call as instruments relevant to these 14 parameters or soil-related instruments. Examination of these instruments in this group, which have come from data being put into a number of global databases, the UN FAO SOLEX and the FAO LEX databases, by example, indicate that a hierarchy of acts and laws and decrees, orders, regulations have been identified. And around 89 in total fall into this group in the Southeast Asian region. But many of these are what we refer to as multi-purpose instruments. The 14 parameters that have been used to identify soil-related instruments in the region comprise soil conservation, restoration, quality, monitoring, erosion, organic loss, nutrient imbalance, salinisation or sodification, soil sealing, soil biodiversity loss, soil pollution, soil acidification, soil compaction, and waterlogging. Now, I have on this screen here just 5 of the 11 countries in the region, and for each of these countries, from the database, we've identified the type of instruments that the countries refer to as soil-related instruments and the number of instruments in each category. And for example, in the country of Thailand, 6 instruments have been identified in total at this point. If we move to Vietnam, we can see that there's quite a difference in the types of instruments that have been that are in existence that Vietnam refers to as soil-related instruments, and around 30 in total. The Philippines, a different composition again, and as well as Indonesia, which has so far 16 have been identified. So from this, very briefly, some of the observations that have been made include that the states differ in the use of types of instruments and approaches. For example, Thailand, Vietnam and Indonesia, there's a number of acts and pieces of legislation. For Vietnam, quite a lot of decisions have been introduced which in some way refer to soil issues or problems. Indonesia and Malaysia have quite a few regulations in place. The Philippines and Timor-Leste have a preference for legislative orders. And in Cambodia and Laos, the emphasis has been on policy and strategic tools rather than legislative instruments as such. But in this 11-country group, there is only 4 countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Laos, and Indonesia, that have actually identified or identify a specific piece of soil legislation. But some of these have been in existence for quite some time. in relation to Thailand since 1983, Malaysia since 1960, Laos since 2003, but more recently in Indonesia since 2014. So that's very few that we would regard under the definition of soil legislation that actually have been prepared within this region. So it's not really many at all. But most states tend to rely on instruments for environmental protection, land use, such things as disaster prevention, agricultural land use, in relation to soil conservation. So they're multi-purpose pieces of legislation. They're not specific to individual soil problems and soils as a whole. But a number of states have identified a framework of instruments relevant to individual soil problems. But one of the obvious features here is that in looking at the legislation from these database areas, there's a lack of coordinating mechanisms. So they've been introduced independently, and there's really been no emphasis given to how many of these instruments in particular countries would work in unison to solve soil issues. So many environmental instruments are multi-purpose, and in interrogating the individual pieces of legislation, they tend not to take into account ecological characteristics and limitations of soil. Now, moving very quickly to some points about the regional environmental law situation. Well, firstly, ASEAN hosts an international framework for environmental cooperation. The ASEAN Senior Officials on the Environment body is a body of state representatives that meet regularly. So a forum such as this could quite be well set up to discuss soils as a legislative issue. Many ASEAN legal instruments covering socio-cultural and economic factors can actually benefit soil. For example, those that relate to food security, and some very specific instruments, such as the instrument that establishes the ASEAN Biodiversity Centre. In 1985, ASEAN drafted the Agreement on the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, but it has not been has not yet attracted sufficient number of ratifications to come into force. But interestingly, Article 7 of the agreement is specifically for soil. And also, for example, Part 3 of that agreement looks at the conservation of ecological processes. So it has within the draft, some facilities to focus on soil issues. But in effect, the agreement still plays a role in the development of national environmental law and policy in the region. Article 7 on soil, this is extracted directly from the draft instrument. I won't go through it in detail, but interestingly, it provides for procedures that take steps to prevent soil erosion and other forms of degradation and promote measures and safeguard the processes of organic decomposition, etc. It provides for the establishment of land use policies. It provides to take the necessary measures to control erosion, and also to take appropriate measures to rehabilitate eroded and degrading soils, including rehabilitation of soil affected by mineral exploitation. So it is a framework that can be used to look at the drafting of soil legislation. Looking at some other mechanisms in the region, ASEAN has negotiated many soft law and non-binding instruments, environmental issues. Many play a role in shaping laws and policies of respective ASEAN states, but to date there's been none for soil. ASEAN at the international level has played an important role in the involvement in the negotiations on climate change. For example, the joint statement on climate change to COP21, which was prepared by the region. And of course, this is the COP that generated the Paris Agreement. So there's been a significant role there by this region in important global environmental issues. The declaration on the ASEAN post-2015 environmental sustainability and climate change agenda by ASEAN states' heads of government importantly recognises the growing need to address global and transboundary environmental concerns. And of course, that's an important issue in the mainland component, the countries in the mainland component of the ASEAN region. This instrument also mentions ASEAN's obligations to sustainability and achievement of sustainable development. It makes a commitment to states to strengthen international cooperation through the 2030 Agenda and SDGs. And of course, SDG 15, which covers land degradation, is the critical one here in specific relation to soil problems and issues. The ASEAN Strategic Plan on Environment for 2016-2025 includes a number of action plans to address strategic environmental priorities. And we should take particular note of the Strategic Policy 1, which is specifically for nature conservation and biodiversity. And it is possible that through this priority, this strategy policy priority, could be used to introduce some regional objectives for the management of soils. And this plan is intended as a guide for ASEAN cooperation, and in that respect strengthens the regional environmental framework. Another very important issue is that in 2015, the COP12 of the UN Convention on Combat Desertification established the Land Degradation Neutrality Target Setting Program. And this is to support countries to define land degradation neutrality baselines and set voluntary land degradation neutrality targets. At this COP, land degradation neutrality was defined as a state whereby the amount and quality of land resources necessary to support ecosystem functions and services and enhance food security remains stable or increases within specified temporal and spatial scales and ecosystems. And to date, a number of the Southeast Asian countries, the ASEAN countries, have prepared targets under this program, including the Philippines, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Laos. And for example, in relation to the Philippines, in its targets, it seeks to achieve land degradation neutrality by 2030 with the following targets. Now, these are some of the targets. That at least 60% of degraded forest, shrubland and wetlands by 2030 and achieve the balance by 2040. At least 50% of degraded croplands by 2030 and achieve the balance by 2040. To strengthen consensus-based stewardship of protected areas and ancestral domains, and improve soil organic carbon in degraded agricultural areas. So they're pretty impressive targets, and of course they have to be supported by well-founded policies and legislative instruments that provide the framework to cope with these sorts of problems and resolution of these problems. So in conclusion, I'll just make a few points. The first observation is that Southeast Asia has responded to a range of environmental issues with many different types of national instruments over the past 30 years that have some relevance to soil. But few have specialist soil laws, and Dr. Ginski will speak a little bit more about what that term means. And this includes Malaysia, which was, the instrument was introduced in 1960, so it's quite old and very much out of date with contemporary soil environmental problems. The Thailand Land Development Act, introduced in 1983, legislation in Laos in 2003, and more latterly in Indonesia in 2014. Overall, national and regional environmental law and policy regimes in Southeast Asia in relation to soil are what we could regard as incomplete at this stage. The ASEAN Agreement on Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources has influenced national environmental law and policy development. Article 7 could be used for guiding national soil legislation, for example. Southeast Asia could explore many other opportunities to improve its legislative basis for soil, and hopefully we can tease a number of these things out over the course of this webinar and at the end. But I'd just like to finish with a statement that comes from a publication by Professor Ben Boer in 2018 on environmental law in Southeast Asia, which in the statement is a broad statement, but I think it could apply very specifically to soil. And that is, a great deal more law and policy work needs to be conducted to ensure that the global and regional environmental policy setting, including the Sustainable Development Goals, are adequately implemented so that the myriad serious environmental problems facing the region are more expeditiously addressed. And I think if you insert soil in a number of points in that statement, that it would be very close to the mark. So on that point, I'll conclude, and thank you very much, Dr. Hauser, and I finish my presentation there.
Thank you very much, dear Ian, for this interesting presentation and the insights into a very complex legal topic. I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, I think it works. Perfect. Before we prepared this webinar, I just knew that the ASEAN Agreement on Nature Protection of 1985 has a specific article on soil. Article 7, you mentioned it and explained it. To me, it seemed quite vague to take measures wherever possible towards soil conservation, wherever possible. But as you said, it might be a reference point and a starting point for all national legal activities. So thanks a lot for these insights in the regional and national aspects. I also think that we certainly would come back to the details you provided in our discussion later on. So just a moment, the screen is just blank. Yeah, but no problem, we go on because Professor Ian Hannon has already explained a little bit about the starting point for legal discussions, which is the normally dealing with soil, with this environmental medium, and also with the protection needs of soil. And it's a big challenge for all of us, and also at all levels of action, to understand how soil works, how to avoid further soil erosion, soil contamination, organic matter decline, soil biodiversity loss, contamination, salinization, compaction, sealing, and all other soil threats. This is a major challenge. And we would like to find out what are the key issues here in the Southeast Asian region, what are the main pressures for soils, what are the main challenges in the Southeast Asian region. And therefore, I am happy to introduce you to Dr. Vanvisa Pansak. Dr. Vanvisa Pansak is an assistant professor at the Department of Agricultural Science in the Faculty of Agriculture, Natural Resources and Environment of the Naresuan University in Thailand. She obtained a PhD degree in agricultural science at the Hohenheim University in 2009. Her experiences mainly cover the areas of plant and soil relationship and soil and water conservation, specifically our topic. And currently her focus is on research and also on teaching. Dr. Vanvisa Pansak is the main lecturer for soil and water conservation course and modern concepts in crop production course. And she will talk about key soil issues in Southeast Asia. Vanvisa, the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody from all around the world. And thank you, Irene, for your introduction. And today my talk will be about the key soil issue in Southeast Asia. And in my talk today, I will present first the status of the soils in Southeast Asia and dominant soil degradation type in Southeast Asia, and then the major threats to soil in Southeast Asia regions, a case study in Thailand. And the last point will be some technologies transfer for sustainable soil management in Thailand. And as Professor Ian mentioned in the talk before, Southeast Asia can be divided into two geographic regions. The first, in the mainland Southeast Asia, includes Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And the second is island Southeast Asia, consists of the Brunei, East Timor, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, and parts of Malaysia. The total members are 11 countries. And therefore, the countries in Southeast Asia are vary in diversity, topography, geology, climate, population, land use. Therefore, that influence to the different soil characteristics in Southeast Asia regions. And this slide show the distribution of the dominant soil in the Southeast Asia. You can see that the soil of the mainland in Southeast Asia are classified as agri soils, about 50%. And you also can see the agri soils in the island in the Southeast Asia country. For example, some parts of Indonesia and also some parts in Philippines. And normally agri soils from on the old landscape that normally have an undulating topography and a humid tropical climate. And most agricultural soils have the low level of the plant nutrition, and also they have the problem with the aluminum toxicity and the high erodibility. And for the other factors that affect to the soil resource in Southeast Asia linked to the rapid economic development and urbanization. And this pressure also impact on the land use change. You can see here some part of Thailand from this figure. They do the deforestation from the forest change to the monoculture field crop. And also it also affect to the land management system in many Southeast Asia countries. And also the climate change also have the emerged as the significant source of the risks nowadays. Therefore, the land pressure, soil degradation, climate change, and socio-economic and land occupation issues are the major impact on the status of the soil resource in Southeast Asia regions. And if we talk about the soil degradation type in Southeast Asia, this slide shows the map that dominant the soil degradation type in Southeast Asia. You can see from the map, the major type of the soil degradation in Southeast Asia are water erosion, chemical and physical degradation. You also can see, for example, in Thailand, we have the soil degradation with the chemical degradation and also water erosion. Here, some parts, the northern part of Thailand, we face a lot with the water erosion. While Iceland, Southeast Asia countries, they face with the water erosion and also some physical degradation in some part of the country. And here, if we are zoom into the status of the human-induced soil degradation in Southeast Asia, first issue is the water erosion. And water erosion in the sloping part of Southeast Asia countries normally cover about 40 million hectares. And in Philippines, from the map, you can see it take about 10 million hectares. Indonesia has about 22 million hectares. Thailand's 15% and Vietnam 10% of total. The country areas are in the level of the moderate to extreme the water erosion problems. And here in the second issue is chemical degradation. In this slide, show the combined effect of the soil nutrients, mining, and the pollution. For example, the chemical degradation, we talk about the nutrient depletion, acidity, and toxic aluminum. Therefore, the high relative intense of the chemical degradation that has more than 30% of the total country area can be observed. Here you can see from the map in Thailand, also Cambodia and Malaysia. And for other countries in Southeast Asia, generally with the negligible to light impact. And the third issue is physical degradation. And this physical degradation map show with the soil compaction map. You can see that in the Southeast Asia country, the physical degradation is even more dispersed or seldom than the chemical degradation. And the compaction or crushing or sealing map that I show you, you can see that it's quite relatively unimportant. However, except in Thailand and Philippines, that we have quite a problem for the soil compaction in some parts of the countries. Although they occur in almost the country around the Southeast Asia. And here now I would like to give you the topic with the major threats to soil in the Southeast Asia regions, a case study for the Thailand. And first, when I would like to present about my country in Thailand, I would like to give you some detail about Thailand. In Thailand, we have the agricultural areas about 27 million hectares. And the main agricultural area are the paddy fields, takes about 11 million hectares. For the paddy field, you can see it's distributed for the whole country. And other agricultural area are for the field crop, perennial crop, and also with the orchard. However, in Thailand now, we also have a problem. About 75% of agricultural land had been degraded. And here I would like to show you the soil topography map in Thailand. If you see here in the part of the northern Thailand, the soil is sandy loam soil. And normally the topography in the northern part Thailand, we have a high and slope land. And also a lot of area are in the mountainous regions. And in northern part of Thailand, we face a lot of problem with the deforestation, shifting cultivation, and also the high rate of the water erosion. And when we talk about the northeastern of Thailand, the soil is sandy soil with the problem of the low fertility and organic matter. And also we found some problem with the high erosion. And in the central part of Thailand, the soil is clay soil from alluvium plant. It is from Chao Phraya River. That's a main river in the center part of Thailand. And normally with the soil in the central part of Thailand, with the clay soil, normally is a high fertility. And the center part of Thailand normally is the main part for the rice cultivation in Thailand. And if we talk about in the southern part Thailand, soil is normally with a shallow soil, and also we observe also with a high erosion rate. And for the soil degradation in Thailand, the first soil issue should be with the water erosion, as Professor Ian used to mention before. And it's quite important issue in Thailand also for the water erosion. And normally water erosion distribute in the whole country in the length of moderate to high, as you can see from the erosion map here in this slide. And the soil erosion problem in Thailand is about 17 million hectares. And especially normally the soil erosion occur in the mountainous region in the northern part of Thailand. Moreover, some soil have the physical and chemical property that lead them unsuitable for the crop cultivation. Therefore, the most of them occur naturally, and the priority of the soil resource in Thailand should be first with the soil erosion that we observe this problem mainly in the northern part and southern part of Thailand. With the organic matter depletion, this problem occur around the whole country. In Thailand, for the salt effect soil, the main area that have this problem is in the northeast of Thailand. And for the acid surface soil, the main area for this soil problem is in the center part of Thailand. And for the sandy soil, also this occur in the big area in the northeast of Thailand. With the organic soil and shallow soil, for these two type of the soil, we found a lot in the southern part of Thailand. Therefore, farmers need to improve all these soil problem and the land condition before they start to planting or start to use this land. And now I would like to give you some technology transfer for the sustainable soil management in Thailand. The example first is from the Loyalty Initial Project of Majesty King Bhumibol Adulyadej. And for this one, I would like to give you all for some example because King Bhumibol, he worked a lot for the soil research and also do a lot of projects that try to solve and improve the soil result in Thailand. And King Bhumibol also was the leadership and commitment on the soil sustainable and land development activity in Thailand. And one important of His Majesty initiative project try to solve the soil problem with the soil acidity problem is Kang Din in Thai. This is Thai name Kang Din, but in English maybe you can call the tricking the soil. Yeah, is it the method that consisting of the alternatively drying out of and wetting the land to accelerate the soil's chemical reaction and raise the acidity to the minimum. Moreover, the soil is de-acidified through various techniques that he also transferred this knowledge from the project. For example, controlling the groundwater level to prevent the release of the sulfuric acid, or apply the lambing material. And also he transferred the knowledge to improve the acidity soil with the washing away the acidity with the water, or even try to suggest or introduce to the farmer with the selected crop that can resist with the acid soil. And the last project that's quite important also, that's our King Bhumibol. He is the one who introduced the vetiver grass for controlling the water erosion. And also now we introduce this vetiver grass or the knowledge to use vetiver grass to protect the soil at the soil and water conservation also. And the other department that involved for the sustainable soil management in Thailand is Land Development Department. And normally that Land Development Department work closely also with the Royal Project. And Land Development Department in Thailand is under the Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperative. Therefore, normally they also have the main responsibility in land use planning, and also do some soil analysis for the farmer, soil improvement and conservation, and also they do with the land use management and socio-economic survey for the farmer, or collect all the data and can provide this kind of the data for the whole country in Thailand. And now they also open for the people or a lot of work that you can access from their database. And Land Development Department, they also do the analysis for the soil, as I mentioned before, to the farmer. And at the same time, they also teach the farmer how to collect the soil sample and send to the laboratory for analysis. And LDD or Land Development Department do the analysis for soil nutrients for free to the farmer, that when farmer get the result from their soil, and then they can use for planning for the next crop planting. And at the same time, now they create the project for construction of the farm pond for the soil and water conservation. But in this project, we call the farmer also had to contribute some cost. Is in terms of the cost sharing between LDD and the farmer also. And at the same time, LDD also provides some we call LDD product. For example, LDD provide a vetiver grass to the farmer, and also provide some knowledge how to grow the vetiver grass in terms of soil and water conservation, and also provide a microbial activator for the farmer that farmer can use to make their own compost to improve the soil quality, and also provide a green manure seeds to the farmer also. And the last project that I think is quite have a big impact that LDD did the establishment of the soil doctor warranty is quite powerful in terms of transfer the knowledge about soil management from land development department, because now LDD already have the soil doctor warranty is about, I think, 80,000 people, and they have a soil doctor in all villages. And normally soil doctors, they can transfer the knowledge from LDD staff. Even they're the one who can distribute the LDD product to the farmer in their village. And even the soil doctor, they will be the one who establish the demonstration plot based on the soil conservation purpose, or even if LDD have some project would like to demonstration to the farmer for the improvement of the soil nutrients, the soil doctor will be the one who install the demonstration plot. And here my last slide would like to show you some LDD transfer knowledge technology for the soil management. For example, you can see they build up the bench terrace for the farmer that located in the mountainous regions area. And even the LDD also provide the vetiver grass, as I told you. At the same time, they also teach the farmer how to build up the vetiver grass contour line in the food tree. And at the same time, they do now with the farm pond with the soil conservation. Even now, for improving the soil nutrient in the soil, they also introduce the intercropping system to the farmer. This is some example that they do the corn together with bean. So thank you for your attention. This is all my presentation.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for starting at a point where we lawyers normally don't start, namely the soil types in Southeast Asia, their differences, the status of soil degradation, and specific soil threats, and also for explaining the diversity of soils in all 11 countries. That gave us so many insights. So thank you very much. And I also think that the case study of Thailand has given us a lot of ideas. What are the possibilities to act to protect soils or to sustainably use soils? So thank you very much for your presentation and also for sticking to the time. Maybe just a short remark. We started with the presentation of Professor Ian Hannon to give you an overview of the legal basis concerning soil protection, soil governance in the Southeast Asian region. And then we wanted to dive deeper with regard to the soil threats, like Dr. Vanvisa Pansak has already explained. So this is intended as an introductory webinar. So that was the reason. I've also seen some other questions in the Q&A box. So we will deal with these later on in the discussion. I already mentioned that in other countries or other regions around the world, we already have effective regulations on soil protection or sustainable use of soils that we can fall back on or consider as suggestions or model acts for soil protection or for shaping soil protection law. My colleague, Dr. Harad Ginski, has started and led some of these projects, and I'm happy that he can be with us today. Dr. Harad Ginski is an environmental lawyer working for the German Environment Agency called UBA. His main topics of interest are soil, water, oceans, climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as societal transformation. He is an expert for national, European and international environmental law and has already written about 100 scientific papers. Congratulations for that. He is a member of the German delegations to the UNCCD, OSPAR, International Seabed Authority, and he's the chief editor of the International Yearbook of Soil Law and Policy. I'm sure he will mention this excellent work in his presentation. So, which requirements does soil governance have to meet? What is your experience concerning projects in other regions of the world? And is it possible to say that there are model soil protection laws despite the variability of soil resources? Dear Harad, we are keen on your presentation for the next 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Irene, for your very kind introduction. Good afternoon to the Asian region. Good morning in Germany and Europe. Good evening, wherever you may be. Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear participants. I'm delighted to be invited to talk on this webinar on the topic soil law and governance. My colleague, Professor Pansak, has already explained the factual and conditions and challenges of soil management in the region, and Professor Hennen has outlined the current legislation in states of the Asian region. My talk will build on that and will consider what is generally needed for an effective legislation to ensure a sustainable management of soils. Rocky, please, the next slide. So first, I would like to talk about the reasons why we need soil governance. On the slide, you find a very simple and clear phrase. Soils are your future. With other words, without healthy soils, sustainable development of the societies in Southeast Asia would not be achievable. Thus, I intentionally use the word your future to express that we are talking today. What we are talking today is not only an academic issue. It is about the potential realities in the future for all people living right now and for next generations. Why is that so? A few arguments. First, soils are an important sequester of carbon and thus important for climate mitigation and adaptation measures. Second, soils are crucial habitats for plants and animals, thus very critical for the maintenance of biodiversity. Moreover, soils protect as a buffer groundwater and other aquatic systems. In addition, soils are also important from an economic perspective, as they are required for the production of food and renewable energy plants. And finally, soils carry somewhat our culture and our history. These positive effects could be characterized as the social and ecological services of soils, which are so important for your future and for our future. At the same time, we need to be aware that soils are still increasingly degraded, leading for many people to a situation where they lose the ability to sustain and to make their living, in particular in developing countries. They lead also to displacement and migration within a country and beyond borders, to an accelerated climate change and loss of biodiversity, as well as to potentially political and even military tensions. Thus, there are very good reasons to protect our soils. Next slide, please. We should think about what is the challenge when talking about good governance. Three aspects need to be taken into account. First, soil management is a cross-cutting topic, as almost every human activity affects soils. Let's think about buildings, streets, food production, industrial facilities. All these human activities may have effects on soils. Second, before we talk about governance, we need to consider which may be the drivers of soil degradation. The following ones need to be mentioned: bad agricultural practices, land take by urbanization, contamination by industry or infrastructure, destruction of soils by detrimental forestry, an often neglected aspect, negative effects by climate change. Moreover, water scarcity, floodings, extreme weather events may have detrimental effects. And last but not least, poverty often leads to unsustainable use of natural resources, including soils. And third, there's an additional major challenge, as soils are so distinct concerning the physical characteristics. Professor Pansak has elucidated this aspect in her presentation. Next slide, please. But there's one good thing, and Irene has already mentioned it. It is that we could currently perceive a very high level of awareness for soil protection aspects amongst scientists, policymakers, and the general public. The starting point was in 2012, when state leaders committed themselves to the idea of land degradation neutral world and a Rio +20 outcome document. 3 years later, and Professor Hennen has already mentioned that, this objective was included as one of the 169 targets of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which was then approved by the UN General Assembly in September 2015. Land degradation neutrality. It is important to mention, as Ian already explained, that the objective refers to both the quantity and the quality of healthy soils. The objective of land degradation neutrality thus addresses also the social and ecological services of soils. Since 2018, we have seen several report studies which again and again have underscored the importance of soils, and in particular, the ecological and social services. Reports by IPCC, IPBES, and many other studies. And finally, the COVID-19 pandemic has also highlighted some important aspects. I could also mention two of them. First, we need to ensure that our systems, for example, food supply, need to be more resilient. And moreover, we need to be more careful concerning a potential mismanagement of natural habitats, as this could be one reason for new zoonosis and then for further pandemics. Next slide, please. Before I go into the details of my talk, I would like to explain what I mean when using the term soil governance. It's a not really clear term. Soil governance not only includes legal provisions, this would be far too simple, but also addresses the institutional and financial endowment, as well as economic incentives. Thus, governance is understood very broadly, meaning all measures, instruments, and arrangements which could have steering effects for soil management. And then some more background on the legal thinking. Soil governance could be found on international level. We have international treaties as the UNCCD, CBD, and UNFCCC. Soil governance on regional level means regulations by, for example, the European Union or the ASEAN Treaty. Professor Hennen already explained some of the international and regional provisions on soil governance. But I would like to say, in my view, the national level is most important for two reasons. First, national governance normally has an immediate effect on the ground. Second, it's politically relatively easy to influence the development of national legislation. To the opposite, for new international arrangements or even treaty provisions, consensus by many states is required. Next slide, please. Irene gave you some background on my work, but I would like to provide you some more details. I have been working on the topic of soil governance now for more than 2 decades, starting first with the national perspective in Germany. Later on, I was then involved in analysis of many other national legislations, and I was in charge of organizing workshops on soil governance in Africa and India. Furthermore, I have co-managed with a colleague in South Africa, Professor Rupel, a project which is called Mapping Out Options for Model Legislation for Sustainable Soil Management in Africa. And finally, as Irene has pointed out, I'm the editor-in-chief of now 4 volumes of the International Yearbook of Soil Law and Policy, and have written some of these papers which Irene has mentioned. Next slide, please. So now I go a bit more into detail how national soil legislation and governance should look like. So my first slide is on what should be the objectives of national soil governance, and I have here 4. From a political perspective, the overall objective of soil governance is a sustainable soil management. So this is very vague and broad. But to make it a bit more specific, in legal terms, it would be crucial to have stipulated that soils are acknowledged as natural resources in your legislation, that social and ecological services of soils should be maintained and enhanced, and finally, that the objective of land degradation neutrality should be achieved. It would be wonderful if you, in your work, could analyze whether in your respective national legislation, such objectives are expressively entailed. Next slide, please. You have seen that I have conducted many research work on soil governance. The outcome of them is that it would be beneficial to have a soil framework legislation established in the respective national legislations. What should be included in this framework legislation? 3 points. First, the objectives should be expressively mentioned. Second point is that a permission a control system for potentially detrimental land and soil uses should be also established in order that the competent authorities are in a position to assess the future activities and to minimize or at best prevent negative effects on soils. And the third point, moreover, such a framework legislation should also entail an obligation that negative effects on soils, which could not be avoided, need to be compensated by soil enhancements in other locations, and thereby the objective of net neutrality could be realized. Next slide, please. As I said before, soil management is a cross-cutting topic. So there are many other sectoral provisions which are relevant for soil protection. I would like to mention only 2 of them: industrial facilities and mining. So there's a need to streamline these sectoral provisions with the general objectives in the soil framework legislation. Next slide, please. Rocky, next slide. Thank you. It is important to say, and Professor Pansak has already mentioned it, good governance depends a lot on data and information. Those data provide knowledge on the conditions of soil in the specific locations, and potential services, its vulnerability, as well as about the current uses. So this data and information just provide the baseline for any future management measures. In order to get this information, you would need to establish soil-specific entities in your home countries. These entities should then gather, evaluate, assess soil data and information. And furthermore, the information needs to be made available for policymakers and other users. To build up these scientific entities, it is a long-term task, but nevertheless, in fact, indispensable for good governance. Next slide, please. This is a bit complicated aspect, but many research studies have shown that the success of soil governance in practice very much depend on legally binding standards for the various soil threats. For example, compaction, erosion, soil sealing, loss of carbon, biodiversity, salinization, water scarcity, flooding. What is meant by, next slide, please, on standards, please. What? No, yeah, standards, thank you. Standards, that's right. Thank you, Rocky. What is meant by standards? These standards should define what is legally permitted and what is prohibited. For example, what amount of fertilizer may be applied, what kind of chemicals may be released from industrial facilities. Those standards are important in two regards. First, the user would know what is legally permissible, and second, the competent authority would be instructed what needs to be implemented and enforced, not only vague obligations and ambitions, but very clear and specific requirements. From a practical perspective, it would be very demanding if all states would have to determine such standards by themselves. It's fortunately, the FAO has already published guidelines on various soil threats, for example, pollution, erosion, and biodiversity, which could be used as a basis, or at least as a starting point, by all competent authorities. Next slide. No, this is back. We need tenure rights. Thank you. Another aspect, access to land is extremely important. Lack of legal clarity often is a strong impediment to sustainable soil management, as people are not really clear on their responsibilities. This is also an issue, as I have heard, in the Asian region. Sometimes this lack of clarity is caused by a conflict of so-called modern law and traditional concepts of land ownership. But this, by the clarification of tenure rights, it could be achieved that poverty eradication could be achieved. Furthermore, it is one important instrument to control foreign investors and to avoid illegitimate land acquisitions. Important to say, usually clarity on land tenure is also a basis for more environmental responsibility. And finally, it leads to a level playing field for all, and by this, to more justice for all. Next slide. So this is my second last slide. It is fundamentally important to establish effective institutional settings and arrangements for the implementation and enforcement. Experience show that clever provisions are only ink on the paper without an effective implementation, enforcement, and sometimes necessary sanctions. Moreover, it is important to ensure that the administrative arrangements are effective and cost efficient. Thus, the roles and responsibilities of the various ministries and competent authorities needs to be clearly determined by legal provision. It is necessary to clearly attribute the various governmental and administrative tasks to each entity in order to avoid overlaps. So what kind of tasks do I have in mind? And I mentioned already a lot of them. So for example, the gathering of information, the dissemination, the development of standards, the ex ante control of activities, monitoring and enforcement. So these are all tasks, and it needs to be clearly determined who is in charge of implementing and enforcing these responsibilities. I would like to point out, because this is sometimes neglected, that based on experiences in Germany, Africa, and India, that this decision-making process on the attribution of responsibilities is a very time-consuming issue. It is complicated, conflictuous, so you need time, and you should not underestimate this challenge. Next slide, please, and this is my last one. I have now 3 final thoughts. The first one is it's a kind of a recommendation. Do not hesitate. Time has never been as ripe as now for ambitious soil governance provisions. And we need to act now because it's so urgent, given the climate change, the food insecurity, the loss of biodiversity. So please go ahead. The second point is, you can't do it by yourself only. Improvements of soil legislation is not an academic exercise. One should involve the society, all relevant actors, stakeholders, farmers, industry, science, women, youth, to mention some of them. There are 2 good reasons to do that. First, to get their support, and secondly, to listen to their needs and to design the national provisions accordingly. And now my last point. Please do not reinvent the wheel. There's so much out there to rely on and to build on. The work of the IUCN Specialist Group has already been mentioned, the yearbook, and also the work of the FAO on soil governance. So there's a lot to do and a lot available, and please use it. Before I end, I would like to congratulate again the colleagues from the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law for having arranged this important webinar. Soils are your future. I repeat that. Thus, we need to engage to achieve an effective protection and management of soils. And I'm certainly willing to assist this important endeavor here in Southeast Asia. So many thanks for your patience and interest, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Many thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much, Harad, for your presentation and for explaining what the main challenges of soil law and governance are, starting with the increased awareness of the Rio +20 conference and going deeper into the framework for legislation in this field. And you very well explained the specific standards that are needed, the instruments, the obstacles for implementation and enforcement, also, for example, tenure rights as obstacles. And it would be very interesting to find out what the specific problems concerning soil scientific and legal aspects are also from the participants' view or participants' experience. But before we start this Q&A session, we come straight to the next and our last presentation, which is intended as an intervention by Silvia Banco-Besa. Silvia is a legal officer at the Law Division of UNEP, where she worked for more than 20 years, handling both international and national environmental law issues. She's currently working with the National Environmental Law Unit of the Law Division at UNEP, and she previously worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tanzania as a foreign service officer. We are happy that you join our webinar today. And we all know how much UNEP is interested in soil protection issues. You might know UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly, has a resolution on soil pollution, managing soil pollution to achieve soil sustainable development is the title, adopted at the end of 2018. And the lead organization in soil governance and these issues at the United Nations is the Food and Agriculture Organization. And UNEP has collaborated with FAO to prepare a publication on legislative approaches to sustainable agriculture and natural resources governance. Silvia Banco-Besa will give us a brief overview of this publication and the key messages on soil governance. So the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, all. Yes, my presentation. So I'm here, in spite of the title, I'm here to promote the publication, which is fresh from the press in 2020, which is called Legislative Approaches to Sustainable Agriculture and Natural Resources Governance. So the publication is not specific to the region, but at least the region can learn from the legislative approaches that are provided. So that's what I'm here to do. Next slide, please. So the outline of the presentation or the promotion or the advertisement of the publication is the introduction, brief overview of the publication. Soil governance is in chapter 3 on land legislation, but it is also in other chapters, and then a selection of soil legislative areas in 3 categories and examples. I'm just giving you how the publication is structured. It's almost a 600-page publication, and I'll give a brief on the key findings of the publication. Next slide. So UNEP and FAO jointly developed this publication, Legislative Approaches to Sustainable Agriculture and Natural Resources Governance, to document progress made on natural resources law. As you all know, natural resources laws are very old laws in most countries. They are the oldest in the pieces of legislation. But over the years, there have been a lot of legislative approaches that have been developing and evolving. And the purpose of international organizations like UNEP and FAO is to track these developments and to document them and to share it with governments and other stakeholders so that they can inform on legal reform. So the last legislative study before the one that we had, which has been we've just been printed in 2020, was done by FAO in 2002 at Rio Plus 10. And it did not involve all the sectoral areas that we have now in the next bullet, because FAO was focusing on water, land, forestry, fisheries, but those are their areas, and agriculture. But this time, as you can see in the last bullet, we have added mining and petroleum, which were areas of interest of UNEP, and which are also relevant to soil issues. And you'll find soil references in some of these chapters. The next slide, okay, so the recent examples, next please, yes, next slide. So the examples used, we agreed to have these examples, the cutoff date was 10 years. You can find a few examples from countries that have, for example, 2007, 2008 there, because of their importance of that area and because the author could not find suitable examples to those areas. Chapter 1, the way the publication is structured, Chapter 1 provides the introduction to sustainable development and how it's relevant to economic, social, and environmental pillars and their impact. Chapter 2 addresses issues that cut across the sector chapters. So when you are referring to some issues such as public participation and such issues, you don't want to keep on repeating issues that cut across these areas or ecosystem services and how they are related to all these chapters. So there was a different, just a specific chapter that deals with the general issues of permit and authorizations, what they are and how they relate to different sectors. And then the rest are sectorial chapters with linkages, as you all noted in the last slide. Next chapter, next please. Yeah, so with this, as the other speakers have already said, soil cuts across chapters, but it is addressed concretely under Chapter 3 on land legislation. There you'll find the importance of land and soil conservation for sustainable development, the analysis, and the main discussion is in Chapter 3.5, which is on sustainable soil management. Next, please. Next slide. Yeah, so soil laws, according to this publication, may be in specific soil laws or agriculture, land, environment, or water laws. And the examples cited are from different parts of the world. They were just cited not because they were performing better than the others, but they were relevant to the area that was highlighted as areas to be regulated. Yeah, there are soil types and characteristics. The soil types and characteristics determine specific requirements of the land use selected. But soil quality legislative areas in this publication are mainly on contamination and pollution, on the conservation of soil resources, and on the rehabilitation of degraded lands areas. Yeah. Next. So in this publication, it divides soil legislative approaches in 3 categories: activities and degradation, and promotion of conservation practices. And the 3rd category is addressing pollution through surveys, mapping, and remediation mechanisms. Next slide, yeah. So this is just an attempt to show you how what is meant by explicit soil functions according to FAO in 2015. Soil is a finite resource upon which the production of food, feed, fuel, and fiber is dependent. Soil supports critical ecosystem services such as water storage, vegetation, carbon storage, among others. The loss and degradation of soil is not recoverable within a human lifespan. Next. So this is an attempt in a few more slides just to show you how the legislative approaches are structured. So it's important that you read the 600 pages and the relevant areas to be able to know which other areas are covered as legislative approaches. So the first highlighted part is the legislative area. So they say legislation may recognize that soil functions depend on the combination of physical, chemical, and biological properties that result in particular soil qualities, which in turn affect its ecological and productive services. And then they go on and give an example. This example now is from the Bulgarian Soils Act. So it was a law, an act of 2007, but it was amended in 2011. That's why it qualified to be part of this. So it also identifies the protection of soils and their functions. So you'll find more examples. I just picked one so that I don't bore you with all these words. Next slide. Yeah, another example on the protection of soil from harmful activities, the other category, and degradation and promotion of conservation practices. So I just picked one, which was saying legislation may highlight the major threats to soil health and ecosystem services it provides. So it goes on to give the major threats as defined by the World Soil Resources Report, which includes soil erosion by water and wind, soil organic carbon loss, soil nutrient imbalance, soils, and these have been listed by the previous speakers. I don't have to bore you with them. But it goes on to provide examples. I just picked one example from Serbia. So Serbia's law on soil protection defines major threats to soil. So the major threats are there in the publication, but I could not copy every part. Okay, next slide. But just to show you how it is structured and how you can get examples from other countries to help you understand the application of the provisions that are recommended. So provisions to address soil health challenges are context specific and require land users to refrain from certain types of activities or to carry out certain actions. So here again, you'll find so many examples, but I didn't want to bore you again with a lot of information. It's still a lot here. Sri Lanka's soil conservation regulations was provided as an example, and it provides technical land management practices for soil protection. For the example, the text prohibits a person from cultivating annual crops and natural vegetation on forest areas. So I had to cut some information, but if you go to the publication, you'll get the details of the examples that are provided. And it's not only in Sri Lanka, you'll get more countries that fall in this area of regulation. Next slide. Yeah, so this is another example, if I can just skip it, and if you get the presentation, you'll go on and read it. Next slide. Yeah, so the last category was addressing pollution through surveys, mapping, and remediation mechanisms. So legislation may require landowners to investigate, assess, or remedy pollution or contamination. Alternatively, this may be a specific function assigned to the competent authority. So an example is given from the Bulgarian Soils Act again, as amended in 2011, which empowers the competent authority to develop inventories through preliminary surveys and research, to undertake detailed surveys and the rest of the information. Yeah. So I just wanted to show you how the presentation is structured and how useful it can be, and for anyone who is involved in legal reform in the region. And if you want examples on and to identify gaps in the areas that have not been legislated and you wish to legislate them, then you can use this publication to read, to go through areas that relate to soil, not only in the land chapter, but also in the other natural resources chapter that have cover other areas that relate to land. I mean, to soil, sorry about that. Next. Next, I think I'm about to finish. So the key findings of the publication have been listed, and I just picked them here. Soil functions depend on particular soil qualities, which in turn affect ecological and productive services. Legislation may offer various means to balance the competing demands placed upon soil and to provide ways to protect or rehabilitate the resource. Legislation may establish schemes for monitoring and inspection, establishing soil standards and indicators of soil fertility, as well as data collection and reporting. And the last slide says, okay, the soil functions, okay, protection of the soil from threats such as soil erosion, organic carbon loss, soil nutrient imbalance, soil salinization, and other challenges require legislative provisions that are context specific. And various mechanisms are used in legislation to protect soil quality, such as soil pollution mapping, soil management plans, soil quality standard, and soil surveys. Risk assessment often precede remedial actions and assist in the identification of suitable measures. So I hope this gives you an overview of what this publication is all about. So that's why I decided to just give you a preview of what this publication is about. Thanks, Irene.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for your presentation, which has completed our round of presentations and gave us a lot of input to think about the importance of soil and land for sustainable development, and maybe of incentives for sustainable use and management of soil. I've seen that, I saw that Matthew has put the link to this publication into the chat, and you might have a look at this publication, which is really interesting. Only the chapter on land legislation has about 80 pages, so a lot to read after the webinar. So many from my side to all four speakers. You gave us very valuable input for our overview of soil legislation and soil conservation in Southeast Asia. Now we come to the question and answer session, and I hand over to Matthew. Many thanks already from my side, and I'm really interested in finding out what all of you behind the screens are dealing with in terms of soil governance. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Irene. And maybe we can have our panelists, including you, to turn on your videos, because we have a number of questions. And to all our participants, thank you very much for staying with us. There was a lot of information. And when we were approached by Harald and Ian and Irene to look at the issue of soils and soil conservation, we thought it was such a big topic that we needed a number of webinars. So our plan is to follow up with some more focused and targeted information and webinars and more opportunity. But today was about a lot of information. We have a few questions, and then we have a short poll that we're going to ask our participants to complete using the Zoom poll. But I thought I've got a question here from Jane Chin. Thank you, Dr. Hannam. You mentioned in the conclusion that the environmental law and policy for soils in Southeast Asia was incomplete. And I'm wondering if you could give a few examples on that, and perhaps also Dr. Wanwisa, the idea of being incomplete, what might that mean? So Ian, do you want to have first bite at this question? You're still muted, Ian.
Okay, here we go. Yes, thank you for that question. The question came before Harold's presentation and Sylvia's presentation, and I hope that each of those latter two presentations go a little way towards answering that question. What I generally mean by incomplete is that the current situation in Southeast Asia, based on the analysis of the record of legislation that's relevant to those 14 soil parameters, which is being put in there by people from the countries themselves, is that when you scan that legislation or those instruments, a lot of them are very old, going back, as I mentioned in the presentation, to the 1950s. They certainly don't take into consideration a lot of the current, more modern attitude towards constructing legislation for soil around ecological characteristics. Perhaps the only piece of legislation in the region that goes the closest towards this would be the law number 37 that was introduced in Indonesia in 2014, which concerns soil and water conservation. This piece of legislation has 69 articles arranged in 17 chapters. So it does go more towards what current global thinking and standards is about, a more complete piece of legislation for soil. And I think a number of the parameters that, or elements that Harold introduced in his presentation go towards some an outline of some sort of framework that can deal with a wide range of elements that concern the use and management of soil.
Thanks, Ian. I want to sort of go on because I think there's been following on from that, and maybe I can ask Dr. Anwisa about this. There's this idea that's come in some of the questions about focusing on soil conservation as a law, or whether it should be part of comprehensive environmental legislation. And I'm just trying to think, in your experience in Thailand or the region, as a way forward, should we focus on a soils law if there aren't any, or is it better to have soils as part of a comprehensive environmental legislation? Just some thoughts.
Thank you. Actually, I'm not sure my answer about the law or the policy for the soil, because from my experience, there's very touched with the law or the policy for the soil management. But however, I work a lot with the soil and water conservation, that normally I do the experiment with the farmer. And for this issue, I observed that for the soil and water conservation, for the knowledge, I think farmers know very well, because as I mentioned you before, with the land development department, they work for soil and water conservation for more than 20 years already. And they also transfer this knowledge to the farmer. But I think it's not so successful, because I think with the social problem, I can say, and also with the economic part, this is quite complicated. For me, I observe that it's not the scientific topic. It's in combined with the social and economic part. Even the government tried to launch the project, but farmers, they don't accept that. Because when I talk to the farmer, why they don't know that this is good for their soil, but they said that they have to have an income. For example, in the mountainous regions, now they do a lot of monoculture with maize. They do with the deforestation and grow a lot of monoculture for maize, for example, and for sure they create a lot of erosion. And then government also try to promote for the integrated farm, or you can do with the native tree in that area. to preserve the soil in that area. And then farmer come with the question how they can get the income, because they have to spend the money every day. And this issue is combined also for the, I think for the successful case or for the acceptance for the farmer to do the soil and water conservation. Maybe I can complete my.
Yeah, so I would like to come back to the issue of fire and logging and agricultural practices, but maybe Dr. Irina or Dr. Harald, in terms of this approach, from your experience, best practice, is it a specific soils legislation, or is it a broader environmental conservation where soil comes through? So Dr. Harald or Dr. Irina, which would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think it depends on the whole structure of the legal system and how well the awareness is already developed. So it depends on whether soil functions are completely protected and what are the specific soil threats which are, whether all soil threats are tackled, and whether there is a complete protection of soil. And this could be in a very specific Soil Protection Act, or it could also be as part of a whole comprehensive environmental act or environmental law system. So this is a more structural problem. Sometimes the interlinkages between the environmental media is better in a comprehensive environmental protection act, but sometimes it needs also, soil needs to be protected as well, and it has not been protected in the same way as other environmental media. So there has to be some lessons to learn first, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew, if I may, I would give a slightly different answer to this question as Irina did. She made a correct legal analysis that it depends to a certain extent to the legal tradition history in a specific country. But given my experience and given the situation right now, I would think a specific framework law on soil protection is most important for two reasons. First, to acknowledge the importance of soil protection for the future and to make this acknowledgement clear to the society. First point. And secondly, normally, if you have a specific law, financial resources will be attributed to the implementation of that law. So you will get money to implement measures on the ground. If you have it integrated in an environmental law, it has not this standing. So nobody would question the need of a water law, but why we have a water law and no soil law? So this is my answer to this question. In most legislation, you will find a specific law on water protection, water use, but the same is needed for soils as well. Okay.
So I think this is a good topic for our next webinar, to look at the legislative frameworks. And I know we have experts from China and who have done work in China and Mongolia. We talked about Iran. But I just want to, just because of the time, but Dr. Wanmisa, we have a couple of questions about sort of illegal logging or that farmers are burning the fields, which gets back to the practical impact. And certainly in Thailand, this is an annual issue about land management practices, but also it creates issues in Indonesia with haze, which is the catastrophic level of burning, maybe not related to specifically agricultural practices, but consequential. I mean, is there a way of using soil legislation or soil policy to transition or to change some of these agricultural practices to avoid, air pollution, carbon emissions, and the like, do you think?
Thank you, Matthew. I think you know very well also because you are now in Bangkok. And for this issue, for the biomass burning in Thailand, we face a big problem, I think, in these 3 years, that the air pollution increased with the 2.5 PM. This is from the biomass burning. But so far, based on my knowledge and my experience, we don't, how to say, the real law or policy, we try, Actually, I think I can say that what the government try to do is ask for the participation for the farmer and try to give them the knowledge how the big impact that if farmer burn the biomass residual. And at the same time, they try to push the project or launch the project that can support the farmer who not burn. For example, maybe they provide some product. For example, with the, how to say, the way to, the knowledge, the way to make the compost from the biomass residual. They don't have to burn it, but they can do the compost, or even they can sell their biomass residual to the biomass power plant. That's now, this is the other campaign that for the government. Now we just allow the private company start to use the biomass to produce the electricity, something like that. But it's more,
So
I think it should be like ask farmer for the participate. Yeah.
I think this highlights that healthy soils and good soils governance has a lot of potential environmental benefit as well as hopefully economic benefit. I now want to just sort of move on in terms of the question from Professor Yin Nguyen, one of our environmental law champions in Myanmar. She asked about the impact of illegal logging on soil deterioration. And I wonder, in terms of, from an international experience or from a national experience, is illegal logging one of those issues, and obviously removing of root stocks, and is that something that often features in soil governance regulations or laws dealing with soil governance?
In Thailand?
In Thailand or internationally?
Oh, for the international, I'm not sure, but in Thailand, I think, as I informed you before, that for the soil issue, normally we have the big department, or this issue also linked to the land development department, that they work a lot for this one. And also they, when they connect to the farmer, and also they are the one who how to say, push the issue to the government, that later on, government can use as a guideline to make a law or the policy for the soil management in Thailand. I mean, yeah.
Thank you.
And also with the soil doctor that I told you. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Harald.
In Germany, we do not face so much illegal logging, but the interface between forests and soil is increasingly coming up to the awareness of soil activists, people who are engaged in soil protection. Because if you destroy a forest, the soil dies more or less. But if the soil dies, also the forest is affected. So there's a strong interface, which is so far not integrated in our legislation, and we need to think about that and that of this more in depth. This is the same situation in Zambia. In Zambia, there's a lot of illegal logging. The forest dies and the soil dies too. So we need to think about that and come up with solutions, but it's not really taken into account sufficiently for the time being.
I would like to add
Yes.
one point also. Just when Professor Harad mentioned, and one policy that the Thai government runs the project for this illegal logging, something like that. No, they try to promote for the community forest. It's allow the village or the province can manage by themselves. They can organize the law or the policy by themselves, and they allow the farmer to go inside and get some product from the forest.
Okay.
It's quite successful case also.
Okay, interesting point.
So Dr. Ian, you and I worked on native vegetation clearing cases 30 years ago, where people were prosecuted for clearing, native vegetation on farmland. Yet since then, I think that the issue of illegal clearing of forests or native vegetation has sort of dropped a little bit off the radar for good soils governance. They seem to be treated separately. Is this your experience, in Mongolia or China or Australia?
The experience in Australia mainly relates to broad area agriculture, and geographically the main area of concern, ecologically, has been the marginal lands, the land that's used for opportunistic cropping, where vegetation systems have still been cleared for that opportunistic broadacre crop. But by comparison to Southeast Asia, where by area the main land use is small area farming and quite often in very steep land, people clear to get access to land to grow crops and foods for survival, for subsistence use. And the types of controls that can be directed to this situation is very different to the Australian situation. And again, very different to, you mentioned Mongolia. This is a very completely different system there of tenure and legislation. But specifically in the Southeast Asian area, I think that a lot of the points that Dr. Wanwisa made in relation to land management practices and working with the farmers in an educative sense and getting them to understand how to use alternate techniques like burning is at this stage probably the best way to go in those geographic situations. But other soil problems like pollution-related problems, salinity-related problems, they're more related to lowland areas where farm sizes are larger, where clearing has been undertaken many years ago, and it's a different land management system altogether to the forested and partially forested situations.
Thank you. So before we close, and I know we've been going for 2 hours, so there's been a lot of information, a lot of good questions, including some very interesting one about Indigenous people and soil ownership, and one from the Philippines, thanking you all for having the webinar, because it's an issue that doesn't seem to arise much in the Philippines. I have a short polling thing, but I would invite all of our participants to quickly do, and this will help us also for our future. So if we can do this polling for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back, and I was going to ask if anyone wanted to have some final closing comments before we close. So sorry, I have to relaunch. So we have, it's just a very simple poll. There's no right and wrong answer. We're just wondering if you are involved in soil governance, if it's a new topic, you are very involved or little involved. And then the second question is whether you'd like to learn more about soils governance, whether a webinar or a smaller discussion group, or we even discussed the idea of perhaps a masterclass, because we have some significant expertise within the region as well. And then there are some particular issues. We did have 4 other issues, but unfortunately I was unable to amend the poll for some reason. So unfortunately, these are the 5 that we've got: erosion, contamination, acidification, salinization, health of soils. We also looked at urban development, land degradation, food security, and climate change. Unfortunately, those 4 are not on the list because my inability to amend the poll. I do apologize. So we'll just leave that up, but I was wondering, in terms of final words, can I ask Dr. Harald, would you like to make some final words? Or Dr. Ian?
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Just a couple of brief points. I think this webinar has given us the opportunity to think a little bit more and understand a little bit more from outside the region, you know, what the situation within the region is, and hopefully experience that has been gained from working on this topic in other parts of the world. We could make that available to the Southeast Asian region and help provide some direction for the future. One thing that, you know, certainly from the part that I've played in this, there's a lot of legislative material that exists now, and it's been recognised in a way by default because soil problems are being defined, and then countries have to go out and find what legislation fits those problems, rather than the other way around, which is the preferred way to go. Understand the problems and then design something, policy, strategic tools and legislation and so on to work with those problems and understand them better and help manage them. So if we can look at those sort of processes in another webinar like this one, I think there's a lot of knowledge that can be shared on this topic.
Thank you, Ian. Dr. Harald, and certainly thank the German Environment Agency for his support.
Thank you too. I found it also a very interesting webinar, understanding a bit better the situation in the region, as Ian has pointed it out a minute ago. I wanted to highlight one point which is sometimes a bit underestimated. It's also a bit a new topic, which is climate adaptation by soil management measures in urban areas. Because we all know that given the increase of temperature, urban areas will be more strongly affected than rural areas. And we need to think about appropriate measures. And actually, what is appropriate is more nature in the cities. And for this end, we need healthy soils in urban areas. So this is also a point we need to consider in future a bit more in depth. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Wanwisa, would you like to? Still on mute.
Okay, for me, I think it's quite a good event that you organize this talk. That for me, I think as Professor Ian mentioned before, we already get started to learn from each other in the now go to the international levels. And I think for the future, and then we can push more or push forward to the soil governance issue, or even we can bring the strengthen the network that we more or less can learn from each other. Yeah, this is for me.
And Sylvia, are you still there? Would you like to, I'm not sure if, so maybe Dr. Arine, would you like also, and certainly to thank you as the chair of the World Commission on Environmental Law Specialist Group on Soil Desertification and Sustainable Agriculture. Thank you very much for your participation here. And would you like to make some final observations before I share the results of the poll?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. And thanks again for all of the presentations, which I really found so interesting. And of course, it would be really worthwhile to dig deeper and to learn more about each single aspect included. And one aspect is that just came into my mind from my traveling in Southeast Asian countries, which I really appreciate. I got the impression that the people are much more connected to their soils than we know here in Europe. And yeah, one goal would be that this inner and outer connection might also be reflected in a better way also in the legal status. So this would be really something. How can we improve the legal status of soils in all of the national, regional, and of course also in the international frameworks? This might be a topic also for the next webinars. So many thanks from my side. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you, Dr. Wanisa, Dr. Ian, Dr. Harold, Dr. Arine, Sylvia. Thank you all for your presentations. And again, as I say, this is perhaps the first of some planned more workshops, because we realize that this is sometimes of a new issue. And so if I can share quickly the results to everyone. So for most of the audience here, it was a new topic, although a third did have some involvement in soils governance. So there's clearly a lot of interest. And a lot of interest for more information, but also for a masterclass. So that's something I think for smaller groups where we can go a little bit more in depth. The challenge with the webinar is that it is very broad. And then in terms of the issues, obviously health of soils, but in some respects, one can argue that the health of the soils is the overarching issue that we are trying to deal with in terms of soil governance. But I do think that provides us with some opportunities for topics going forward into the future, both on webinars and maybe organising a small masterclass where we can look at some of these in a lot more depth. Again, I'm sorry. Again, I would very much like to thank all of our participants, and in particular also the support of the WCEL specialist group, the German Environment Agency, the LawAsia UN Environment Programme, and the University of New England, who are all on board to promote and support this webinar. It's been a great pleasure from behalf of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. This is our first webinar, which we've streamed on YouTube, and we will make all the presentations available after the event for those who are interested in receiving them. Again, thank you all very, very much for giving up the time, and thank you to all the participants. for your questions and your issues and your encouragement. And I look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar on soils government. So, Kop Kun Krap, Danke schön. Thank you very much indeed. Sade Kap, goodbye. Bye all.